Hello everyone. Today I'm with Stacey Shelby and we're going to talk about Stacey's book Love and Soul Making. And Stacey, you are an educator and author. You've written another book before this one, I think, Tracking the Wild Woman. And you are an adjunct faculty at Pacifica Graduate Institute. So welcome.
Thank you so much, John. Nice to be here and chatting with you.
Stacey, just to start, before we dive into our conversation, I used to live in Sydney a long time ago, and I was in the corporate world and management development and all of that. And I went into a bookshop one day, and James Hillman's book, The Myth of Analysis, virtually fell off the shelf and fell onto my lap. So I started reading it, and I hadn't had any introduction to Jung at that time. I started reading that book, and you know, the more I think about it, Hillman's myth to me, or if I could put it, you know, in kind of blunt language, the guts of his book, The Myth of Analysis, is the myth of Eros and Psyche, which I think is also the guts of your book, in a way. So, but you know, one of the things about that is that I don't know, like Freud had his myth, you know, the Oedipus myth and mother love and father rivalry, and then Joseph Campbell had the hero myth or whatever. And not that I can't relate to a lot of that work, but I think to me that the real beauty of James Hillman, I know it's just not him, Marie-Louise von Franz and Eric Nyman before, they have spoken about this myth as well, but I think one of the great things about Hillman is that not only has he talked about that myth, but he kind of, to me, he has the passion of Eros, you know, in the way he goes about psychology and the service to the psyche or the soul. There's something, I can see both in him, you know, that, and I think it makes for something very pleasure. Like the thing that got me from that story was how Voluptus was born from the conjunction of, you know, Psyche and Eros. It's kind of like that there's a pleasure that can come through psychology.
Yeah.
So anyway, getting back to, well, throwing it over to you, your book.
Yeah.
Tell us about it and why. How did you come to write it, first off, maybe?
Gosh, well, first of all, what an initiation by fire for you, having the myth of analysis land on your head. That's a big one to jump in with, for sure. Hillman is a very dense writer, and I agree with recognizing his myth is probably much more embedded in Psyche and Eros, if for no other reason other than potentially his biggest contribution as a post-Jungian is the valuing of the imagination in its pure essence and not trying to analyze imagination with logos and rationality, but rather relate to it. So the reason that, I mean, that was kind of Hillman's like ultimate work in the tiniest nutshell. But the reason that's so embedded in Psyche and Eros is because Psyche communicates to us as individuals through image and through imagination. And so being in service to imagination is communicating with Psyche. It's being engaged in that related experience. And of course, Eros being the God of love and connection, and he creates those divine connections with his bow and arrow. So anytime we're relating with that Eros principle to image, we are acting out the union of Psyche and Eros. So Hillman was just such a strong advocate for that, above analysis and above logos and rationality and even consciousness, which I can kind of toggle quite nicely between Jung and Hillman. It's not an either or for me, and I understand that's a bit of a polarity to hold, where Jung was very much advocate for consciousness and expanding consciousness, where Hillman evolved that toward being an advocate for imagination and relating with the image. And I tend to hold both of those with just, in the scales of whatever is happening in the moment, to value both of them. So how I came to be writing this book on Psyche and Eros, love and soul making. Well, it's called Love and Soul Making, Searching the Depth of Romantic Love. The working title was Psyche and Eros Forever. And then at the end, we titled it. When I wrote my dissertation on the wild woman archetype, I wrote about women going through the individuation process of becoming authentic through the trials and tribulations of romantic love. And that would also be applicable for people who identify as male as well. I just didn't feel qualified to write that. I'm hoping that other men will do that. And I believe that's happening. I know some men who have expressed interest in that. So that evolved, and that turned into my first book, which was Tracking the Wild Woman Archetype. And because Psyche and Eros was so embedded in that myth, along with alchemy, love and soul making was just a evolution and a progression of it. It's very hard to end a book because the work is never done. So at some point you just have to say, this work is ending here. And then, it evolves and the next one comes, and, so the work just continues.
Transmutes into the next
exactly.
iteration.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So tell us maybe, if you could, Stacey, just a little bit about the story of the myth. What strikes you most about it? What were you thinking of when you began writing this one, Love and Soul Making?
Yeah. What had been getting clearer and clearer to me after writing Tracking the Wild Woman Archetype, and then I was teaching Psyche and Eros, the psychology and mythology of romantic love at Pacifica, and I had been teaching that course for a few years by that point, and I designed the course, so I was really just in that psychoactive field of the material. And what I think the thing that really clarified was romantic love is an imagination, an image, a fantasy that we live out in the external world, and maybe desire in our internal world. But it's also, and maybe most poignantly, because it's not very conscious in culture, is the desire for the relationship with soul, with psyche. And so as I came to understand that romantic love was a mirror or a reflection of the internal relationship between psyche and Eros, love and soul, or soul and love in that reversed order, it came to be an understanding that it was a myth about loving life and about being really engaged with the anima mundi, the world soul, and really connecting with that unique place in that greater web of life and who we are as individuals. I feel like I can't even talk about this without an image. Like if we imagine the anima mundi as a web that has beautiful little sparkly fingers that come out of it, and we're all part of that. We're all just unique parts of that. And so the anima mundi, the world soul, living out through us, and so fulfilling our part of being in relationship to soul, both the personal soul of psyche, individual soul, and the anima mundi, greater. it just seems like that is engaging with life and vitality, and all of the, mucky human entanglements are actually just kind of part of that soul making process of being alive and being vital.
So there's there's romantic love, and then there's the love of the world as well. So you're kind of connecting them all in a way. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's the romantic love, like the human to human relationships. There's the internal conjunctio of the personal relationships that goes on. And then there's the psyche and eros of being related in that more cosmological or anima mundi, to the anima mundi. That's probably a better word than cosmological, which would become a bit more spiritual, actually.
Yeah.
And that's maybe worth just a quick point of differentiation, which Hillman also did a great job of clarifying too, but it is important. If spirituality, and I would also identify as being a spiritual person, but to be in depth psychology, you absolutely don't have to be. Spirituality would be closer to purity and transcendence and the cosmological and
going up the mountain, Hillman.
Going up the mountain, exactly that metaphor, perfection, these things. Whereas soul is kind of down and into the roots and into the muck and into the messiness of life. It's getting in there and living and not holding back or not transcending and not trying to do it perfectly, like just having all of the experiences that are available because we're here in this human body, right? So those two things would be separate. I would say spirit would be eternal in my personal belief system, whereas soul, if there is no body, there's no soul. So soul is alive the individual soul is alive as long as the human is here.
And the soul, I don't know, when you read Thomas More and Hillman, it likes its attachments and its particularities and its particular kind of food and, its particular people.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. And there's, like an almost a grittiness to it. We can talk about that, and Hillman talks about this too, with soul food and soul music and things that just kind of stir the soul. These are all soulful experiences. They're more rooty rather than high pitched. Mm-hmm.
And I think, I don't know, in my own personal experience, having gone off to India as a 21-year-old and into a transcendental kind of meditation on the top of the mountain, like there's some wonderful things about that, some very wonderful things, but I think one gets called down somewhere along the line because it's not possible to live in that kind of place forever. And it seems that the depth factor comes in where, one has to find out how to bring a pleasure into this life rather than just transcend this life or something like that.
Well, and I think if we're striving for perfection and spirituality, then we're transcending just really the gamut of human emotions, and that includes pleasure and joy. We're also probably transcending the grief and the suffering, but then we're not engaging with the gift of being here, of being alive and in life with bodies that have these senses. So I think pleasure is, in all the ways we can derive pleasure, whether that's a little hummingbird or my cute little dog's jiggly belly, or, whatever, all the different ways that pleasure can be part of our human experience. It's a very meaningful experience, along with other meaningful experiences like giving back and service and learning, education. These are also very important for our existence, for our sense of value and meaningfulness. But pleasure is as well. And it can pretty easily get put on the back burner in favor of like duty and responsibility, right? And we have to get it much more on the front.
Yeah. Well, it seems to me we've got a bit of that Christian, I mean, I know I probably shouldn't say this, but there is a little bit of a Christian residue in the sense of the anti-pleasure.
Yeah, the purity,
idea.
right? Yeah. Yeah. And I think we're a long ways from fully escaping that, like we're many years of being steeped in quite pure spiritual traditions. So coming back to the body, that's a relatively new shift. Maybe, I think Jung thought it started at the dawning of the age of Aquarius in the 60s, right? Like astrologically, that was kind of a shift that was happening throughout the world. I don't know enough about astrology to say that, but it does seem like a relatively new phenomenon. And the reason pleasure becomes important, you had asked me to do a recap of the story, so maybe I'll go back to that and do a quick recap of the tale. So Psyche, which means soul, is a beautiful mortal woman, and Aphrodite, or Venus, who's the goddess of love, beauty, and sexuality, gets all up in a rage because the humans are starting to worship Psyche rather than Venus, and so they're misplacing their adoration. So Aphrodite sends her son Eros to go and kill her, and there's a big conspiracy. The father is involved. Then she's supposed to go for her wedding day to the top of the mountain, and Eros accidentally pricks his finger and falls in love with Psyche. So then he can't kill her. He sweeps her off to his castle, and they live in the dark. She's not allowed to look upon him. And they live there quite blissfully until her sisters start to tell her that she's living with a hideous monster. And then she eventually, all the doubts creep in, and she brings the lamplight of consciousness and gazes upon him and realizes that she's actually fallen in love with the god of love. And he's more beautiful than she could ever have imagined. And he wakes up because a hot drop of the oil lands on him, and he's betrayed and in a big huff, and he flies off. So then that sets in motion the 4 impossible tasks. So she goes to Aphrodite, begs for guidance to win back Eros's favor. And she has to go through these 4 impossible tasks, each meant to destroy her. And I won't necessarily break down each of those tasks just for brevity, but it's important that it's the goddess of love who is guiding this. So she's both the poison and the cure, right? Like she's the one who's putting her through this. But each of these tasks cause Psyche to grow and expand. So soul, through its experiences and challenges in life, gains more wisdom and more refine and more depth. And so she eventually completes the 4 tasks. It's important at the end of the 4th task, coming back from Hades with Persephone's beauty ointment, she makes her first conscious choice and decision and opens this box of beauty ointment, which she's been told not to do, and it renders her into a death sleep. That is the moment that Eros finally returns to the story, and he has swooped down and he pricks her with the arrow, and then that awakens her. Some stories say it's the kiss. There's quite a beautiful sculpture that's quite famous of Psyche and Eros and the kiss, and she grows her wings and they fly off to Olympus and marry. And the very, very end of the tale is she gives birth to a girl child, and the name often translates as pleasure or harmony or voluptuous, as you mentioned. So that all that labor of growing through the sufferings of soul in our human experience results in a life that is a new life named pleasure, that we get to enjoy pleasure and harmony. So there's a happy ending at the story.
Yeah. Well, it's not like Freud's, Oedipal myth. There's no kind of, what's the word? Redemption, maybe. That's what it might seem like. Whereas somehow in this story, there is the experiences go towards something redemptive, maybe.
Yeah, they do. Yeah. There's an interesting...
But that doesn't mean it's any easier, by the way, if I could just throw that in, the sufferings or the tasks or the...
No, and I don't know that everybody makes it through the sufferings or the tasks, or even that everybody has to do all of them. I think it was Neumann, Eric Neumann, who said that not everybody is called to the fourth task. That's saved for the few. And that as a psychotherapist myself, that does seem to be true. Not everybody is called to have to visit Hades and back. Usually they have to somehow be involved with healing work in whatever description that might be, right? Yeah. It's a very broad term.
So just going back 1 second, Stacey, this is kind of what you're saying about romantic love, that hidden behind romantic love is this, what you've just been talking about, that it's there as maybe an undercurrent, or maybe someone's more conscious of it, or is that it?
Well, I like this term metaphorical vision. So if we engage with our own desires with metaphorical vision, and not to diminish our human desires, but for romantic love, say we have a yearning for a particular type of partner, or maybe a specific person, in fact, that's sparked our imagination. The imagination always has to be sparked, or there's no chemistry, right? Imagination's always involved. Yeah. And so if we look at that with that metaphorical lens, well, what else could we interpret that? If we just played that out as a narrative on a screen and watched that objectively, what would we be observing there? So often we'll be attracted to somebody who's psychologically, their type function is quite our opposite. And so, okay, maybe there's something in our inferior function that is calling for development at this point. That is kind of a common one, unfortunately. Very difficult one, but a common one, right? Yeah. So if we can look with metaphorical vision at what's happening with that desire, the desire being the guide, then we can also understand that it's not only this human person or fantasy or desire, but also this internal one that's happening. Like the world is dreaming through us this thing, right? This, whatever this metaphor might be about.
And somehow the impossibilities of love deepen us. But it's so tricky, isn't it? Because it's so easy to go one side or the other. Like I was saying earlier to you that I remember reading Robert Johnson, and he was talking about the projections of love. And sometimes you get the feeling like it's like Jung 101. If someone's just started Jung, that, oh, that person's just a projection, an animate figure, da-da-da, da-da-da. And it's kind of like there's nothing worse than what is it? The maltreatment of the human and loving connection. But on the other hand, if we're all just person and the romantic other, then missing some of the psychology. So how does one keep in the middle?
And that, I think, is exactly the task, depending on our value system, perhaps, is to try, like as a therapist, I do try to stay in the middle. I mean, maybe most of all, I do identify as a bit of a hopeless romantic. I love romance. So when clients are having new romance and falling in love, I'm just so excited for them. So it's it's such a magical.
You start crying in the.
I know. I'm just thrilled, and then they have their first rupture, and I'm like, okay, now we got to prepare. It's just such a magical, precious precious experience, right? That falling in love, and it's rare. And as we get older, we realize how rare and precious it actually is. So trying to hold that as a balance, so that sometimes means bringing in, oh, does this person perhaps represent something of your anima? Is there some work that could be done internally, or animus, or something of a character or behavior that's internal to you that, we might consider fostering? And that might take some pressure off the relationship, even so that the relationship can thrive. So it's like finding just the right amount of consciousness to bring in, because consciousness can just kill that romance, and it's just too precious and mysterious.
I can think of Marie-Louise von France talking about being overanalyzed.
Yeah.
And I was thinking of that this morning. It's like when there's that constant analysis, which is kind of like what Hillman's trying to get away from anyway, isn't it?
Yeah.
It can be a damaging thing, overanalysis.
Yes. Oh, so damaging, because then we're so far in favor of logos and rationality that we're not in service to psyche and eros. And as somebody that does work in the healing professions, or I don't really like that word actually at all, but in care of others, I like the word therapy because it means care. I think that is actually what heals, is that care. So supporting other people with genuine care is bringing in psyche and eros, right? That is where there can be some, magical repair and corrective experiences happen. So when we can be in that therapeutic place of really caring for somebody's soul and what they're saying, then, and their experiences and how those experiences affected them, that's a lot different than being in that analyzing, what does it mean? That just kind of fosters that separation between the head and the body, which, we've got enough of that going on. We don't need more of that. So trying to be in that.
In my language, Eros is a mighty daemon, mysterious force, and psyche is also a mystery. So the thing of mystery is maybe paramount.
Yeah.
The mystery that is greater is always
Yeah.
kind of.
And so often what's required is just reconnecting to that, the mystery that is greater, whatever word we want to use to call that, it doesn't really matter. But just connecting to that just alleviates so many deep sufferings, like loneliness in particular. If we're feeling connected to that which is greater, then we're not suffering loneliness, and that's a real epidemic that shows up in symptoms of the soul, such as depressions and anxieties and, all of these things that we now have scientific medications for. And those things have their place, don't get me wrong, but we also have to build that relationship to the mystery.
So Stacey, what do you teach this material, right? What do people that come along say? What are the questions you get, and what are the feedback you get, and what do they bring up time and again?
It's so interesting. It's usually taught in the third year. Of a PhD program. So, by then, fortunately, they're familiar with Jung. And yet I don't think I've ever started a cohort that at least a few didn't come in with a lot of trepidation and maybe even some defensiveness about just like, it's so personal and so vulnerable. Like it's tender material, talking about what they come in believing to be romantic love, right? And that's where we start. But the course is designed as a trajectory of like really developing that connection with soul. And then what is being asked of the conscious personality from soul? How can the ego, the conscious identity, relate to soul? And so often that ends up being much more even vocational callings that come forward, because now the person is relating to their personal soul and, fulfilling purpose in a more meaningful way. So I think students, and because Pacifica has such a vast age range where, we might have some students in their late 20s, early 30s, which would be on the very young side. And then we've had students in their 70s, and they could all be in the same cohort. That's not uncommon. And then everything in between. So it's, people might have been married for decades, and other people may have never been married or still exploring their gender identity or different, like anything could be going on. There's just a huge range. And so people come in kind of guarded and unsure and trying to be open and hopeful and curious. And anytime we can spark curiosity, then the fear will pull back. So I always try to get people curious, like thinking with curiosity about what is your relationship to relationships, to psyche, to eros, to romantic love, and just be curious. Because when we can get that sparked up, fear and curiosity are just not good bedfellows. So we can foster curiosity, the fear can pull back a little bit.
That's a nice point.
Mm-hmm.
So, and you yourself, what have you learned from writing this? What struck you the most? I mean, obviously, it's been from the beginning, I imagine, from the tracking the wild woman to now. So that's 2 books, right?
Yeah.
That's a pretty long, deepening process in anyone's language.
Yeah. Yeah.
What's been hitting you about all this?
Well, it continues to evolve. I mean, honestly, even prior to that, most of my graduate research was on ayahuasca and plant medicine before that was as mainstream as it is now, like certainly before there were conferences, which is slightly funny. So I had kind of gone through 22 papers that were 20 pages each of exploring plant medicine. And, and in those years, ironically, even though it's a plant spirit, it was bringing me back down and into the body. So it was actually really helping me get rooted, even though it's a spiritual practice. And then that evolved into the wild woman research. And gosh, when I was writing that, I was like still coming off of spiritual bypassing as a phase, and very much in
maybe it's sorry, I'm butting in for 1 second, but
that's okay.
Maybe that spiritual bypassing, which at the moment we have a go at for good reason, but maybe it's a necessary phase in the scheme of things so. As well sometimes.
Yeah,
because it's kind of like a detachment from the senses, a stepping back.
Objectivity.
Yeah.
And finding our own relation to God or greater, whatever that is for each of us. I think it is. For me, it was certainly a necessary stage. And then becoming very aware of the inner life as a really dynamic and creative
reality.
Reality. That's the right word. Like to the point that I'm like, yeah, that's probably really where most everything happens, is in that inner reality. And then, my ego just kind of happily thinks that it's in control, and that's just good. We'll just let it think that. But, I kind of that who's dreaming who, I generally think that inner reality where we're so close to the archetypes and the unconscious and psyche that can hold the personal unconscious and conscious. I think that's the one that's usually driving. We have some capacity to co-create, I believe, but not always. Like we can't just say we want $10 million and then boom, we got it. Like we would have all done that by now.
Unfortunately. And
Yeah.
I remember people, I think it was your colleague, Mary Antonia Wood, talking about, Jung and the alien will, that there's something about, I don't like the word alien, but there is something alien about Eros too, isn't there? Like, it is a daemon force in a way, isn't it?
Yeah, the daimon, it is, and it is that like reality of the in-between, right? Eros, the anima animus, the daimon. These are all like actual, and I would say dragons and fairies all fit in here too. They're actual realities, but they're not necessarily of the consensual material reality, but they have a lot of effect on our material reality in our lives. So maybe even with the daimon, that was my first exposure to Jung, was actually through James Hillman's The Soul's Code, where he talks about the daimon and the calling of the individual. It is this kind of guiding force that there is a certain reality to it, but it's closer to the imaginal. We can know it through the imaginal.
Sometimes writing, I know this isn't about romantic love, but sometimes when I've been writing, the way I see Psyche and Eros happening is that, okay, Psyche about interiority, reflection, the deepening, working, the love, the working with the material, etc. But maybe you're going around a little bit all of that. And then, one day you can have a sleep or you can forget about the material or whatever. And then you wake up the next morning and it's like, wow, there's the mysterious inspired Eros. And you go, I know, I can write about that today, or it'll be,
Yeah.
It kind of comes, but it's like you've got no control. And maybe it doesn't come. Maybe you work the material and but then sometimes it comes just like a flash, and that's the inspired thing that happens.
I kind of think it's everything to do with romantic love. Like if you're not in a romance with the work that you're working on and that's working on you, it doesn't flow, right? Like anything creative, whether it's lived out in the human relationship or in any kind of creative expression, the Psyche and Eros are present. Like I think it's everything to do with romantic love, but just not in that limited expression of two humans together, right? Like that's just not a big enough expression of what's actually happening with it.
So you're widening the idea of it there.
Yeah.
The romance of the world and
the romance of the world and the romance of everything we do that's creative and inspired and sparks imagination. Right?
And I think maybe one other thing from my experience that's common to both, romantic relationships and life and writing and creativity is that the libido comes and goes of its own volition at times. Like this thing of giving up the willpower is, or there's something of, to me, a pleasure of life is kind of learning how to go with those movements more. As they come and go. Like sometimes you need to be very patient and just stop and not write or not work, or and then but then other times it's all go full steam ahead, and it's kind of like getting keyed into those kind of things.
Yeah, and it does. I would say we could almost interchange Eros and libido, although they are sort of different, maybe. That Eros is known for, especially in his younger form, known to kind of fly off, like he is there and then he flies off. And then it's as that connecting principle within us matures, then it has more ability to stay and nurture its commitments, right? So committing to a big body of work to write, that's a very mature Eros function, because that's a very big commitment to follow that through. But the energy does, Jung referred to it as progress and regress. He wrote this really complicated scientific essay on libido, where he set out to measure the affect of complexes with this empirical model. I don't know, it's a very difficult essay. But that part of that essay was about how libido regresses into the unconscious at times where it needs to like build up energy again, and it might need to work out on a complex or something, and then it can come out again and flow. And so there's this idea that we have a finite amount of libido available to us as individuals, but we can divert some of that into, you know, either the flow of life or creative works or sexuality. We instinctually very strongly direct it towards sexuality. Jung did eventually agree with Freud on that. But he also said, but we can divert it. We don't have to just act out the sexual desires and impulses. We can put it towards some other creative, inspired something that's meaningful to us.
And some people might say that's kind of, I don't know, like a sublimating or something, but I think, yeah. I don't really necessarily think that's always true, though, because I remember Marie-Louise von France saying, when people don't fulfill their creative life or their creative instinct or something, these are not the exact words, but they fall in love with the wrong people, and it's kind of like they need, you know, it's kind of like, it's that idea that creativity is also an essential thing, and that sometimes our need of people can be through this lack of fulfilling that or something like that.
Yeah. There's a very strong relationship between, and I haven't wrote enough about this to have it articulated, but I know that it's true from experience, between psyche and eros, love and soul, and creativity. Like, there's no creativity without love and soul. Then you're just kind of trying to grind it through with willpower, and that can't get you terribly far, actually, right? There has to be like that passion that comes from love and soul. So on the heels of a very big creative endeavor, we'll often just need to kind of rest and let the energy build again and kind of collect and pull it back. And, you know, it can take time to have that build up again. Or when we're in the midst of writing something, like you said, as a creative writer, then sometimes we just need to sleep on it for a few days before the new inspiration clarifies, and we can suddenly know what needs to be put down on paper. Yeah.
But you know what people might say when they're listening to this, oh, I listened to this podcast because I thought they were going to talk about Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor or something, and or, you know, David Beckham and Posh Spice or something like that, and then how are we talking about these psychological things?
Yeah. Well, and gosh, those are even good examples because we have so many like fantastical people in our culture that we have as like really holding archetypal starlight for us, and that is projection. We are projecting that individually and collectively onto those people. But if we take that back and put that internally and come into relationship with those archetypal figures within ourselves, then we start to be able to, I want to say things like live more authentically and actualize our potential that we can intuit. You know, these kinds of things come to mind. So yeah, back to, I know people do struggle so much with romantic love that what they actually want to learn about is romantic love, and why is my partner a narcissist, and why is my girlfriend borderline, and those are very popular terms right now, you know, and everybody's all projecting and blaming each other. And you know, if you can pull it back from the human relationship and turn it inward and seek personal insight. Very often there's practical things like boundaries that need to happen, but that's also related to that inner work and inner psychological work of knowing how to set boundaries for ourselves that are aligned with our personal values and beliefs, ideas, ideals, all of those things that are actually individually or ours rather than enculturated into us.
So the last question, Stacey, the $800 million question is...
You got 800 million dollars to pull to it?
Sorry to just throw this on you. But the thing of inner and outer with romantic love, to come into action, not to come into action, to develop the inner world. My own feeling is that there's no one right way. And I tend towards the idea that, everything's sacred. Everything, not just certain aspects. The whole world is sacred in a way. But what do you say? What do you say to people?
There's definitely so I'm thinking about my caseload as a therapist, and there's definitely some people that are quite extroverted that just need to be able to live these things in the external world and in the human world. And then my work is not really to have them be self-reflective about internal archetypes, because that's probably not their natural way, but to be self-reflective about what their individual needs or values might be, because that's still helping them realize themselves. So some people have more propensity toward needing to do things externally, and that works just fine. Some people will want to come and talk about dreams or be in a difficult relationship or vocation or loss of meaning, and then they'll want to work with that internally. And as a therapist, it's just really meeting people where they're at. I don't know that there's a right or wrong for that. From my own personal experience, when I was writing Tracking the Wild Woman, I was very much in an animus projection with an actual person. And I was in a relationship with that person to a certain type of degree. I ended up calling it unrequited love, that technically wasn't right, but anyway, so there was a person, there was an actual person. And I was like solidly in my time at Pacifica as a student. I knew what the animus was. I knew what projection was. I knew what shadow work was. Like, these were not new terms to me. And my therapist very gently and kindly says to me, "Do you think he's maybe acting as a guide to your interior life?" And I was like, no, absolutely not. Nope, that's not what's happening. It's just him. And I believed that, that was my truth at that time. And she was gracious enough to not burst the bubble of projection. And I have tremendous respect for her for doing that, because she could see it and she could have burst it. But I needed to live it out externally at that time. Retrospectively, it's quite funny, because I can look at it and I can be like, oh yeah, wow. Like, of course, that's what he was, along with the human experience. But, so we can't just do it alone in our interior life. There has to be human others, then human complications. And that is the muck of soul making and life and being in it. So it's not one without the other. I don't think we have to necessarily bring a high degree of consciousness to it, unless that's the person's individual value.
And we always learn through others. And it's one thing I appreciate through Hillman is that one can't go it alone. That out on the tender edge, that is where so many things have learned.
Yeah.
I learned. Because there is a tendency in so-called spiritual people to sometimes think the other way, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it can be, safer and easier if we just try to internalize everything, right? And, like Jung said, we can't individuate sitting on our meditation cushions. We can't. We need the complications of human experience. And that's, if we want to grow, we have to be engaged in life, right? And if growth is a value. And if growth isn't a value, then hopefully something like pleasure and enjoying being here on this planet is a value, right? Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you very much, Stacey. And what is your third book going to be about now that you've finished this one? Can you just give us a little bit of a preview?
Yeah, the third one is alchemy. Gently scratch my head about why Psyche, are you putting me through that? But I've got probably 140 pages of notes, and I just taught alchemy. Actually, I just finished, I think last week, teaching alchemy at Pacifica. It was so rich and great and wonderful. So yeah, I'm without a doubt called to alchemy, but at the moment, I'm really trying to honor the birth of pleasure. And I'm living in Los Angeles, and I get down to the ocean every day and get my feet in the water, and just having this really pleasurable experience with the sun and the sand and the water and the food and the vibrancy of a big city. I haven't ever lived in a big city like this before. So just some time to gestate and enjoy pleasure. And I know the alchemy is there. It's talking to me.
I think it's just brings such a different imagination, like the fire, and the red, so all of, even to this topic we've been talking about today. But I admire anyone that can write about alchemy without getting lost in the forest, because it is so you just admire when people, like I remember speaking to Stan Marlin, and when people can kind of sift through all of the stuff, and come to those kind of powerful images, and it's good, but it's a life work almost.
It is, in the sense that the language is immensely complicated, and I think that was for elitist reasons. And there were not a lot of women, if any, which is interesting and maybe all the more inspiring for me to throw my voice in there. Of course, we have some post-Jungians who are now female alchemy writers. But in a way, it's other than the language being incredibly complicated, I think the process itself is actually not terribly complicated. And much like a myth, it's just kind of laid out in specific steps. And I don't think it needs to be as complicated as the alchemists made it, actually. I think that was sort of for elitist reasons. So I'm going to endeavor to make it a bit more accessible. Yeah, but it's a lot, again, with Psyche, it's a lot about imagination. The alchemists were projecting the inner contents onto the substance, so.
But it's an unusual imagination in the sense of, I think, because it comes in from left of field, like heating the substance or this or that or whatever, that it brings in a fresh way of looking at the whole thing. That's what I find what's so beautiful about it.
Yes, that's true. And working with the substances. Yeah. So that's the next one.
All right. Thank you very much. And thank you for speaking. And I just wanted to say before we ended, I think you've got a lovely way of writing about these complex topics, which is also very personable. And I enjoy, I've enjoyed reading Love and Soul Making. I think it's a really good book.
Great. Thank you, John. I appreciate that. That's really nice. Thank you.
Thank you. See you later.
Thanks.